I'd like to welcome everyone to this afternoon's Town Hall meeting. I'd like to specifically extend a welcome to Regent Dakovich and Acting President Lakari, as well as all of you who have taken the time out of your busy schedules, I know, to hear a little bit more about the business cases that we've heard Deloitte present to the Board of Regents at their meeting last Thursday. Specifically, we'll be going through a presentation that represents a subset of what was presented to the board last Thursday. The slides that you'll be seeing today will also be available on our website, as the presentation that was presented on Thursday is linked from our website to the board site as well if you're interested in the whole presentation. Following the presentations by the consultants, we will have a question and answer session to address any questions that you may have regarding these business cases. And then following the overall town hall meeting, we will have press availability in the space behind us for any media who may be here. This town hall meeting is being streamed live, so if you are listening remotely, you can still submit questions for anyone interested. We'll capture those using the form that's on the web page. And this streaming will also be available sometime later on this week if you're interested in watching a portion of it after the fact, or if you know someone who is not able to attend. And that will also be available off of our homepage, specifically on the TIER site. Without any further ado, I will turn it over to Rick Ferraro with Deloitte.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for welcoming us again to Northern Iowa. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm not going to have any opening remarks, but I will participate in the Q&A. I'm going to turn it over to Virginia Frazier, as I'm sure you're all very interested in getting into the detail and having lots of questions. Virginia?
Thank you, Rick. And thank you, everyone, for having us here today. I am Virginia Frazier, the project manager for TIER, and I'm going to start things off by orienting you to the material that we're going to be presenting in today's slides. But before I do that, I would like to thank all of the faculty, staff, and students who participated in the analysis that we'll be presenting today. We truly appreciate all of the inputs that we've received on our campus to date and look forward to more inputs to come. As Kelly alluded to, the document that you're going to see today is a subset of the larger document on the board website, and you'll notice that that document is quite dense. There's a lot of material there. There's a lot of material even in our slides today, but we're not going to cover all of these slides, and we're not going to cover all the material on every slide, because we do want to try to present the highlights so that we then have as much time as possible for questions and answers at the end. After we discuss these materials today, it's also important for you to understand some of the timeline that lies ahead. We presented these materials at the Board of Regents meeting last Thursday. The board will then be reconvening for a regularly scheduled board meeting on October 22nd and 23rd, but they're not going to be voting on these business cases until mid-November. So there's more than a month for the board to consider these business cases and to receive input from all three campuses. So during that time, we're hoping that you will provide input either through the website or through some other channels that Kelly's going to talk about later, and share your thoughts and ideas about these business cases. The presidents of each university will then be presenting this aggregate feedback to the board during the board meeting on October 22nd and 23rd. So we're hoping there's plenty of time for input and feedback before the board does vote on these business cases. And as the team walks through the presentation today, there are three important points that I'd like you to remember about these materials. And these are essential for understanding where we are in this process. The first is that the business cases that we're presenting today are still estimates. They're not to be considered precise or even 100% accurate at this point. This is the next level down of analysis from the original identification of the opportunities that we presented back in June. And their main purpose is to further inform decision-making that will be taking place by the board. So the second thing to remember is that although these business cases at this point are not precise, they are at the right level of analysis to inform the decision-making process. The board is considering transformational change, And as part of that, they need a solid analysis to consider areas to implement. But transformation does require some venturing into the unknown. This analysis represents our best estimate of potential savings using available data analyzed within a limited time frame. And this means available data supplemented by assumptions, and in some cases, new data that we compiled. And we'll talk about that in some of the business cases later. We conducted hundreds of interviews across all 3 institutions and reviewed volumes of university-wide data, including financial data, HR data, policies, systems data. We met with campus leadership to review and discuss observations and assumptions. But still, this analysis is not exhaustive. And yet it doesn't need to be, because it does provide enough directional perspective to inform the decision-making process that lies ahead. And third, we do expect these estimates to change as areas move into implementation and as detailed design proceeds. We're still quite early in this process. Some estimates may go up over time, but many will go down. Estimates of potential savings should be tracked and reported, and new baselines should be established as part of a living, breathing transformation program. As more details available, designs fleshed out, and as further participation is gained across all 3 campuses. This is an expected and a natural part of the process of moving from estimates to establish the viability of a potential opportunity into moving into implementation in certain areas. There are 4 main areas that we're going to be focused on today: finance, human resources, information technology, and facilities. And we're going to be presenting 8 business cases across these administrative areas. These are the remaining administrative areas from the original 12 administrative areas that were selected by the board for further analysis. These areas were analyzed to create business cases and potential new operating models, and were then summarized into an implementation roadmap. Additionally, potential implementation activities and timelines are suggested for consideration. And the Board of Regents may decide at its discretion, using inputs from all 3 campuses, which initiatives to pursue, the implementation timing of these initiatives, and the implementation approach. But first, I'm going to walk you through the beginning sections of this document, just point out a couple things, and then turn things immediately over to our leads to talk about these areas in detail. After they've gone through the business cases, we'll then go ahead and open up for question and answers. So now I'm going to flip to slide 4. It's important to understand some context about these business cases as we go through the presentation today. As I mentioned, phase 2 is the next layer down of the analysis, and it's an analysis of quantifying the potential investment costs and savings associated with each chosen opportunity from phase 2. And as I said, estimating these business cases is quite complex. Also, it's important to understand, as outlined on the 4th bullet of this slide, you may not be able to read it, but all these materials are available online. These business cases have the potential to change the way that work is performed, which could affect the organizational structure and staffing levels at individual universities. For instance, as processes are simplified and as technologies further used to support certain kinds of transactions, the staffing needed to support different types of work may be reduced. In these cases, it's important to note that there are many ways to realize these staffing changes, including by using natural attrition or phased retirements. And this is how we've modeled these business cases for our analysis. If any of these business cases proceeds into implementation, this decision of how to handle any staffing changes would be made by the board and the universities working together. We recognize the sensitivity of this topic, and we want to make sure that you're aware of this as we walk through the business cases today, and that you have an opportunity to ask open questions about these business cases and any modeling that we've done in this area. Now I'm going to flip to slide 6. As I briefly mentioned, there are 3 main outputs from phase 2 that we're going to be covering in today's meeting. The first is business cases, and these business cases are an analysis of a proposed opportunity to facilitate the decision on whether a project should be undertaken and whether it should move into implementation. This is the quantitative and qualitative analysis using the best available information that we have to make these estimates at this point in time. We also, the second icon down there, represents how the universities operate underneath an operating model and how that operates currently and any proposed changes in the future in these different business case areas. The categories of an operating model include governance, people, process, technology, structure, and performance management. The one part of the operating model that we don't have in this report is the very top of that, which is the strategic planning, because that is something that's undertaken right now by each individual university and at the board level. And so we did not do an analysis of that. And then the third area is the implementation roadmap and action plan. And this is a summary of how the opportunities could be implemented over time, along with a list of potential options and actions. Some of these opportunities could be implemented by the universities themselves, while others may require outside support, for example, for areas that require deep expertise to implement or when internal capacity is not available. We're going to talk more about that when we go through the individual business case areas, but it's important to note that this implementation roadmap is an initial idea of how these implementation areas could be sequenced, but we expect that to change too, as the board makes decisions about which areas to pursue, and also as implementation planning were to occur across these areas to get a deeper understanding as well of different initiatives that are already happening across each university and how that may affect some of the implementation areas that are in the roadmap. And finally, I am going to flip over here to slide 22. And want to point out one more thing before I turn things over to our leads. And that's a final consideration before we move into the business cases, which is as the board decides which area to pursue for implementation, there are a few factors that we have suggested that the board consider, which could affect the timeline and the cost to implement these opportunities. And the first is the amount of change that the individual universities and the board can absorb. That's a very important consideration that can't be taken lightly. The second is the number of people within the universities available to support implementation. That's one of the questions that will be asked of each president during that meeting on October 22nd and 23rd, is which areas each university feels they could support on their own and has the capacity to do versus areas where they think they would need additional support. That also fits into point number 3, which is the skill set available within the universities to lead the changes described in this document. That'll also be part of what each president's reporting out on. Next is the funding available to implement business cases. Some of these business cases do require an investment up front to see returns down the line. And that is something that needs to be thought through carefully to see if there is available funding to pursue those areas. And then finally is the dependency between the opportunities. This is a dynamic program that may occur that could take many, many years. And there are lots of dependencies and considerations in the way these business cases may fit together within an individual institution, and even the way that the board manages changes across all 3 institutions to track and monitor the results. So the dependencies among and between these opportunities are important to consider. Now I'd like to turn things over to our IT lead, Shomik Saha, who's going to talk about the information technology business cases.
Thank you, Virginia. My name is Shomik Saha, and I led the analysis on the information technology thread. my pleasure to provide an overview of these different IT business cases that were developed for consideration. The basis for the work on these business cases was the data that we gathered from each of the universities, including UNI, which was then used for the team's discussions within each university and culminated in a number of focused working sessions so that we could validate some key metrics and better understand the IT landscape. But as we clearly, as we reviewed the IT landscape across the three universities, and specifically UNI in particular for today, we clearly recognized a number of key strengths and leading practices across the UNI IT landscape that we should point out. For instance, the use of Oracle eBusiness here showed that enterprise software packages don't need to be highly customized to be effective and useful to support business processes. We also saw the use of technology innovations like the use of Google email as part of the enterprise collaboration fabric as well. And so some of the business cases that we have developed seek to build on these technology innovation practices. And I will reference a few slides here in this presentation, and typically the ones that I'll reference here are a little easier to read from a distance. I'm happy to answer questions related to the other slides as we conclude this presentation. So within IT, there are 4 business cases that address various aspects of the technology function. While these business cases can be implemented independently of each other, we do suggest that there's a favorable sequencing of these business cases, if approved, that can enable the succeeding business cases to build on the successes of the previous. So accordingly, what we will do is we will first review IT04 and IT03, the first 2 rows on top, which deal with the use of technology innovations and simplification of the applications landscape, which could potentially help to lower the cost of technology over the longer term. Then we will discuss IT02 and IT01, which focus on unlocking efficiencies within the IT delivery model. So the first business case that we will discuss today, IT04, has 2 separate components within it, namely what we call a desktop transformation, and secondly, the print green transformation. So let me take those in order. The first initiative that we call the desktop transformation initiative essentially seeks to provide what we call a virtual desktop infrastructure, a VDI infrastructure, to serve some proportion of users whose desktops are at end of life. So these end-of-life desktops could be replaced by thin client devices for them, supported by the appropriate server infrastructure. To take a step back, a thin client essentially is a small, lightweight hardware device that works just like any other computer, but most of the data is stored within the back-end VDI server and not on the thin client. Now, because these thin clients don't have hard drives, their lifespan is typically longer than a typical desktop computer, so they typically only need to be replaced once every 7 years or so. Plus, it is generally easier to replace these malfunctioning or aged thin clients. They also reduce electrical consumption by 50 to 70%, saving some extra money in utilities. So within UNI, we identified about 5,000 plus existing Windows desktops, and we estimate that approximately somewhere between 40 and 60% could potentially be supported using this technology over the longer run. The second initiative that we're suggesting here consists of potential activities to seek to reduce printer, paper, and ink costs over the next 2 to 3 years that we call collectively as the print green transformation. This initiative will encourage the migration of print services from local printers to network printers, and we found over 1,000 such local printers on campus, which are usually, these network printers are usually a little bit more cost effective in terms of printing cost, and are able to guide users towards more cost-effective printing methods, like using duplex printing, for instance. And so we also suggest that an initiative could be undertaken to increase the amount of duplex printing that is done across the campus, which typically ranges around 70%, but could potentially be nudged higher through education, training, and change management methods. So therefore, these two key initiatives form the crux of this future state solution. And while this could potentially unlock savings between $3 and $4 million at steady state across the three universities, for UNI, we estimate at steady state around $495,000 to $660,000 in savings, with a payback period of approximately 30 months or so. So that's the first business case that I'll review. The second business case focuses on the different applications and systems that support the various business processes across the three universities. And for this, I'm going to go to slide 46. What we found was that prior to the work in phase 2, there wasn't an integrated inventory of applications across the three universities. So therefore, a number of discussions and working sessions were conducted to gather and collate the information related to these different applications and systems, totaling to over 750 key applications and systems across the three universities and over 250 across UNI. While this potentially still represents a portion of the total applications and systems that are used, it provided us a number of directional indicators on the types of application landscape simplification opportunities that are available. We found that there were instances of overlapping or similar classes of applications that supported similar business needs. For instance, various types of technology tools like desktop imaging, backup tools, help desk, ticketing tools, reporting tools, database platforms, as well as opportunities in the larger enterprise functional categories like, say, library management or facilities management, where some of the tools and systems are coming to end of life. And hence, they provide an opportunity for more collaboration across the universities. This is a key point because we do believe that there is an opportunity to simplify some of this application landscape, particularly as some of these systems move towards end of life. You know, a term that we use is basically to indicate a technology inflection point, because that is a point where it is typically cheaper in the longer run to make a decision to potentially come together where it makes sense and to use a similar system or tool set. Now, the key, and I'm moving to slide 47 for this, the key challenge for this activity is to provide a forum for effective and collaborative governance on the applications landscape. So therefore, in the future state solution, we suggest the potential forming of a CIO council that will include key IT and functional leaders who can then help to establish a future state application strategy and roadmap across the three universities. The primary mechanism we suggest for this initiative is what we call the process of active governance, whereby as systems are up for retirement or end of life, or if there are systems where there are typically lower costs to change, which are not related to the business processes, the universities can engage in collaborative discussion to determine a more streamlined applications landscape. As an initial marker, we suggest some areas like infrastructure and operations, library management, and facilities management as areas to start on first to unlock licensing, architecture, design, and operational savings. In terms of financials, we think that this could unlock roughly $390,000 in savings for UNI at steady state. So we've reviewed the first two business cases. We'll now turn our attention to the final two business cases. And I turn to slide 50, where those two business cases, IT02 and IT01, focus on unlocking potential efficiencies within the central and the distributed IT service delivery models through using a number of levers like technology innovation and streamlining of service delivery. What we are suggesting in IT02, which focuses on the central IT service delivery model, is that there is some potential to unlock some service efficiencies because of a number of factors. And turning to slide 52, which provides an overview of that business case, I talked about a number of factors. One of those factors is the use of technology innovations like thin client devices and the streamlining of the printer landscape, which would change the dynamic for core technology services and potentially reduce some of the work associated with these devices. Within the central ITS organization as well, longer term, we see potential for looking at the span of control and increasing it towards more between 8 and 10, and that could potentially help in pooling some related services within the central ITS delivery model as well. Further, we suggest the greater use of explicit SLAs or service level agreements so that the performance on services can be clearly measured across the campus and in some cases tweaked so that the optimal balance of effort versus service quality can be achieved. At a high level, we expect savings of roughly $330,000 for UNI with a payback of over a year, and this could potentially lead to a net future state staffing impact of 3, which could be more than addressed using normal attrition. I'll now focus on the final business case, IT01, and move to slide 56 to do so. The business case IT01 basically focuses on the distributed IT service delivery model and also suggests some methods to potentially unlock some efficiencies. As we reviewed the different teams that provide various technology services, we found that there were some overlaps of technology services like, say, desktop management or server management or technology help desk services. These are typically capability areas where some pooling efficiencies can be gained by using similar work processes, similar tool sets, and most importantly, the use of technology innovations like, say, thin clients or the streamlining of the printer landscape. We also found that there were a few server rooms at UNI that could be considered for storage using the central data centers as well, and which could contribute to these business cases. So we see that technology innovation initiatives like the use of thin client devices and simplification of the printer landscape, supported by some efforts to pool these server room computing resources, could unlock efficiencies within this delivery model. However, it is important to emphasize that while we do suggest the next evolution of the service delivery model, we're only suggesting changes to a few capabilities and not to many other capabilities like, say, local applications development, business requirements and analysis, business intelligence services, reporting services, etc. So within this business case for UNI at a high level, we expect savings of roughly $480,000 with a payback of over a year. While this could potentially lead to a net impact of 6, this could be more than addressed using normal attrition. So within this overview, we have covered all the 4 IT business cases. And while there's a lot of information within this document, we are happy to answer any questions that you might have at the conclusion of all of these sections today. With this, I will now invite Emily Todd to discuss the HR and the finance business cases.
to the right slide here. HR. Okay, great. Like Shomik mentioned, my name's Emily Todd, and I am going to talk about the finance and HR business cases today. Similar to the walkthrough Shomik just provided, I'll provide a high-level overview of what the business cases we're looking at, some of the observations related to UNI, and then we can address more detailed questions during the Q&A portion. So the finance business case looked at ways to improve finance transactions across campus. Although each university is unique in people, process, technology, culture, we found that all three universities are struggling with some of the same challenges when it comes to finance transaction processing. So when we think about finance transactions like travel and expense vouchers, procurement requisitions, accounts payable, account reconciliation, these permeate every department in every unit across all three universities. At UNI, as well as at Iowa State and the University of Iowa, we found that most departments rely on local administrative staff to manage some of these transactions and financial services. This can be stressful for staff who are expected to be experts across a wide range of different service areas. It can also create back and forth between the departments and central finance when it comes to allowability and compliance regulations. Because of this, we've seen many institutions in the higher ed industry start to look at shared services as a potential solution to mitigate some of these challenges. So as part of this analysis, we did evaluate shared services at each university. Shared services, in our view, differs from centralized services in many ways. Shared services is a customer-oriented organization that is focused on service excellence, efficient service delivery, and continuous process improvement. With that being said, shared services is not a one-size-fits-all model. The degree of technology automation, HR support, university culture, and stakeholder willingness are all important considerations that need to be considered. So I just wanted to set that context up front before we go into some more of the detail. So in order to be consistent across the analysis for all three institutions, what we ended up doing is modeling two different options, which I'll talk a little bit about. So as you see here on the slide, there's sort of an illustrative model of different types of shared services organizations that often exist in different organizations, both within higher ed and then in industry as well. Obviously, these are illustrative. There are many hybrid models that kind of fall along that spectrum. But what we ended up doing is we modeled a college-based model as well as a university-wide model. And I just want to spend a minute or two talking through those before we get into some more of the detail. So a college-based shared services model proposes that colleges reorganize internally to elevate some of those transactional services out from the department level into trained experts at the college level. So you'll have people that are sitting at the college level that provide services across a wide array of departments. There are many benefits to this model. It's often more widely accepted by departments because you still kind of have that local connection with people that you're familiar with. There's often a quicker time to implement and lower upfront costs and investment required, as well as less effort around change management and organizational design. Some of the challenges of this model is that it can limit your efficiencies gains because you're still kind of duplicating functions across colleges, and colleges may lack the resources to implement this model. On the other side of the spectrum is the university-wide model, which is a more consolidated view where services are provided potentially irrespective of what department or college you sit in. There are many benefits to this model in terms of being able to maximize efficiencies because you're leveraging the whole scale of the university. You're able to have better standardization and minimize duplication of effort and best practice development. But obviously, this is a large shift in the decentralized culture at many universities, so there's significant change management and organizational design that needs to occur, as well as higher upfront implementation costs. So before I just go into some of the specifics of UNI, I'll just talk quickly about how we conducted the analysis. We conducted interviews, reviewed data and technology systems to really get an understanding of the working environments of each institution. We also reviewed the master HR data file at each institution. It made estimates of time spent on different finance transactions based on job descriptions, interviews, and our understanding of similarly sized and structured organizations. This estimate formed the baseline for our analysis. While not 100% accurate, it serves as an indicator as to whether or not there is an opportunity to reduce the level of effort in some of these areas. These estimates will need to be confirmed during implementation, I think like Virginia mentioned earlier. And during implementation, a resource allocation analysis will need to be conducted to assess and confirm current level of effort across each department in the university. Since this effort that we were looking at is spread out across numerous people across campus, careful workforce planning will need to be done to evaluate current department workload and assess where changes can be made. So with that, I'll talk a little bit about what we saw at UNI. So just to start out, I think we saw many strengths here as an organization. There seems to be a commitment across campus to process improvement. So people participating in lean initiatives, trying to really understand how we can operate efficiently, even in the face of missing some technology automation. We've also seen a willingness to kind of collaborate with the University of Iowa and Iowa State on best practices and technology systems, which I think speaks volumes about the culture here. Some of the challenges we saw is that most units on campus don't have dedicated finance staff. So again, they're relying on administrative staff that often have many different job responsibilities that they're responsible for being proficient in. There's also some manual processes in place. So when we think of things like travel and expense or requests for payments, there's paper processes still in existence that can increase kind of the administrative burden at the department level. We also saw an increased audit environment, so transactions being reviewed multiple times at different points in the process, which can create some back and forth and some inefficiency as well. So with that being said, we do think there's an opportunity to look at shared services at UNI, potentially in key areas, like I mentioned, travel, procurement, AP, and also to use technology to automate some of the processes, look at policies and procedures to take into account best practices so we can be more efficient, and also use service level agreements and define metrics to track performance over time to ensure that we are being efficient. Some of the qualitative benefits of moving to this type of model will reduce the administrative burden at the department level. You can potentially reduce your transaction processing time and error rates and increase compliance, as well as having skills aligned with roles and responsibilities to help facilitate good service and efficient processes. I'll just pause on this slide really quickly. There's sort of a high-level timeline up top. And just wanted to note here that, again, more work needs to be done. So the next phase, if a decision is made forward to go look at this or implement shared services in some capacity, there's a lot of design work that needs to occur. So doing that detailed resource allocation analysis, identifying technology requirements and processes that need to be redesigned. And during that process, there will have to be a lot of stakeholder involvement from campus to help define what the future state will really look like at a more detailed level. So just want to point that out, that is a consideration and kind of why the timeline is viewed to be a little bit longer than some of the other business cases you might see. In terms of the summary of some of the benefits and costs, the college-based model for UNI, we're forecasting or estimating potential steady-state savings of about $400,000 annually. Again, these are from using natural attrition of some positions over a period of a few years. So as we're becoming more efficient, having better processes and technology, the level of effort will reduce. For the university-wide model, steady-state savings are forecasted to be around $700,000 annually. So again, this has about a net impact of around 14 FTEs. Again, using better policies, processes, and having people kind of leveraging the scale of the university to drive efficiencies overall. So with that, I will now talk about human resources. So the human resources business case evaluated ways to improve the decentralized HR service delivery model across all three campuses. While the HR analysis was very similar to what I just discussed in finance, it differed in many ways. First of all, the decentralized activities we reviewed as part of the HR business case included both transactional and some strategic HR services. So for example, not only did we evaluate level of effort and processes around personnel action transactions, but we also looked at effort around more strategic activities like recruitment services or FMLA consultation, etc. Unlike the finance business case, we saw that each university has a very different HR structure, very different strengths and challenges. But one HR theme that you will see throughout the 3 business cases is this idea of around business partners to better facilitate HR services across campus. Business partners are trained HR staff that report up through the central HR organization, but provide localized services to departments and colleges. As I go through the material specific to UNI, I'll talk a little bit more about this. So again, with the HR at UNI, we saw many strengths. We actually received feedback from a lot of people on campus that they feel HR at UNI is very responsive, very customer-oriented, which is great. I think that speaks volumes to some of the work that's already been done to date. But we did see that UNI is staffed a little bit leanly around HR when compared to the other 2 institutions. There are no distributed HR resources out in the colleges and departments. So departments, again, rely sort of on their ad hoc administrative staff to provide some HR services locally. Some of the challenges that UNI is facing is around the lack of technology investment in key areas like learning management and position management. And this transactional sort of focus of HR services at UNI has led to some strategic service gaps in areas like workforce planning, and training and development, and performance management. We think an opportunity exists at UNI to invest in the HR function by developing business partner roles. These business partners would support strategic HR activities as well as aid in more unit-specific transactions. They would act as a key contact for HR inquiries, facilitate the recruitment of staff, work on workforce planning, and facilitate policy, procedure, and technology rollout from HR, as well as identify business needs for policy and program changes. So, for example, if we think about recruitment, heavily decentralized process for the most part, these people would know the business of the departments or colleges that they're working with and really help them through that whole process. We can talk about some more examples as well. We think this investment is important because a strong HR function is needed to support ongoing organizational change. So when we think about the TIER program as a whole and what it's trying to accomplish, investment in HR is really key going forward. We also think there's an opportunity to invest in technology modifications and looking at different processes to help be more efficient and perhaps drive the ability for business partners to provide services that don't currently exist at UNI. So in terms of sort of the cost-benefit analysis for this model, ongoing savings are forecasted to not be too substantial. It's around $200,000 annually. So really looking at being more efficient to fund some of these new positions so that those services could be provided campus-wide by these business partners. And again, looking at phasing in these new roles over a period of 3 years. So again, that gives you time to sort of pilot different models, see what works, and be able to tweak things on an ongoing basis. So we wouldn't recommend kind of hiring the full staff right up front, but you could phase it in over 3 years. So with that, that is the HR overview, and I will hand it over to Dave Noon to talk about facilities.
Well, thank you, Emily. My name is Dave Noon, and I'm here today to speak about facilities. As far as pace goes, I'm going to move through these a little more quickly than some of my peers have so we can get to the questions and answers. And then I'll also be presenting the implementation roadmap right before we do that to provide some insights about how things could potentially move forward. So for UNI, there were actually 2 facilities business cases that were developed, and both of the business cases focus on energy management to decrease the overall demand for energy at the university. One of the primary reasons that these 2 business cases were selected for analysis is due to the trend that's emerged of energy prices increasing substantially over the past 10 to 15 years, so that these business cases can play a part in addressing that trend, and at least the trend of the demand for energy. And it's worth noting that we feel both of these UNI business cases relating to facilities could be implemented by the university without external support. So with that, let me move into the facility slides. So the first business case deals with reducing utility consumption by adjusting the thermostats in classroom buildings during evenings and also during the summer. Our team conducted the initial analysis here, and then during August transitioned ownership of this business case to UNI representatives, where they reviewed and updated the business case based on input from stakeholders. And it's with this input that the numbers were adjusted and are reflected in what you see today. It's also important to note that this opportunity was then focused on just the summer, because much of the work of setting thermostats is taking place today during the academic year. So this is a summer-based opportunity at this point. By making these changes that were just mentioned, you can see that the annual savings are forecasted to be about $30,000 per year, and that's all through decrease in energy consumption related to utility bills. And then with this opportunity, it's worth noting that any of the changes would take into account the constraints that were voiced by faculty and staff and sort of the needs that would be specific to each of these buildings. So we think, again, that this could be implemented by the universities. There would be minimal cost because much of this work could be accomplished with existing resources. So it would be approximately $30,000 in ongoing savings on an annual basis. The other business case actually relates to energy management as well, and it analyzed the impact of implementing additional energy management initiatives, which were identified through discussions with UNI staff. And examples of initiatives that are in this business case include things like using demand control ventilation, variable frequency drives for pumps, occupancy sensors, lighting retrofits, and direct digital controls. It's either introducing those ideas or expanding the use. And again, those ideas were they were arrived at in discussions with UNI facility staff. And the initial list here could be implemented over approximately 2 years, we believe, and would require about $600,000 of investment to save roughly $140,000 on an ongoing basis. So again, as I mentioned, looking towards implementation, this business case along with the others could be implemented by the universities, and we think there also would be some merit or benefit to having a formal process to have an ongoing way to identify these initiatives, prioritize them over time, and then monitor and communicating the savings related to facilities. So I will move now actually to the implementation roadmap, which we'll discuss briefly, and then get into your questions. So you heard remarks from Emily, Shomek, Virginia, and me, and I think one thing that hopefully you heard is that the roadmap is a preliminary document. I want you to keep that in mind as we look through it. Lots of the ideas that are here are based on our best understanding right now, and over time there are a few things that could influence the duration and implementation approach that would be followed for each of these areas. So why don't we move? And to just orient you that there is a roadmap, and then we've also constructed, available for review on the board website, is an action plan. And the roadmap just presents the concept of how these opportunities could be sequenced over time. And the action plan will give you some more idea of the concrete steps and actions you'd have to take to realize those benefits over time. So in building on some of the comments Virginia made early on this slide we talk about there are 3 opportunities to implement these, or 3 ways to implement these opportunities. They could be university or board led, they could be consultant coached, or they could be consultant facilitated. And to walk through each of those a little more deliberately, a university or board led approach would mean that it really is transitioned to the university and then is taken forward and implemented. There are benefits to this, obviously. It's less expensive typically from identifying external funds to support, and also you're building internal capability and ownership over time. You would use this approach generally when there are in-house skills to implement that work, and also that people have the available time to support it. Moving down to the next level, you can see consultant coached. And this means that there are sometimes opportunities where the universities have most of the skill set in place or most of the time, but you may need to supplement one of those two. So we think that there are a couple opportunities we'll talk about where it might be a need just for some initial planning to help jumpstart the opportunity and then transition to the universities. And then the final one is consultant facilitated. And this approach is pointing out that there are certain areas where there's probably a very focused and high level of effort that would be required to implement, or there may be skills that are needed that either exist in pockets or don't exist within the university just based on the nature of the work that would be required. So in this situation, consultant facilitated model would be used, but it's important to note for consultant facilitated in all of these areas really, that to implement any of these opportunities, you'd really need to partner with university leaders. You'd have to have input from faculty, staff, and students all along the way, and that is critical to success. Briefly looking at how some of the opportunities that are in the administrative areas would be grouped. This is an initial pass. These are subject to change, as I mentioned, but there are 3 different categories. So the university or board-led, you can see that there are 5 opportunities listed there, 3 of which have actually already been voted on in prior board meetings to move forward as university opportunities. So that would be at the top, you see the HR 10, which relates to the P&S search committee size. And then there are 2 student service opportunities relating to RAI and the Common Application Portal. The other ones that would be university-led, would be proposed as university-led, are the 2 facilities ones we just walked through. And then if you look at the consultant coached, these are all actually IT opportunities. And of course, subject to discretion of the universities and the board, but there could be an opportunity to have some initial planning to help kick these off and get them off on the right foot just based on some insights that a consultant may be able to offer. And then as you look further down, we've got consultant facilitated opportunities. And because of the either level of effort or skill sets that may be required to implement these, there are 4 that fall into this category. And those would be the HR and finance areas that Emily just spoke about, and the IT area that Shomek addressed, as well as a sourcing opportunity that was discussed at a previous board meeting as well. So before we actually look at the roadmap, the last slide here just talks about the fact that there are a few dependencies that exist, and these dependencies are common across really each university and need to be thought about before endeavoring into implementation. The first is a pretty obvious one, the board approval, which there will be a vote in November and determine whether or not to proceed. Any decision there would impact the implementation roadmap and timing. Next would be the implementation approach. One of those 3 alternatives chosen. There are different timing considerations for each of those. And generally speaking, with external support, that would mean that additional resources are put towards that implementation effort and could shorten implementation timeline. So that would have an impact if that is done or not. And then also resource and funding availability. Then something Emily mentioned, which is very important, is having HR leadership in place, which is in place, and getting the HR 01 business case implemented, so that you do have some additional capability in working with all the different units and departments, colleges across campus and the university, so that you are ready to partner in that change and make any tweaks that may be necessary. And then the final 2, one relates to technology, the fact that if there are process changes across the university, that often could lead to a need for an update to an application. So you want to make sure you have technology that plan in place to make updates in those areas. And the final one relates to the IT governance area that Shomek addressed, and the fact that if you're going to be making changes to the application landscape, if you're going to be thinking about making changes to VDI or otherwise, it'd be good to have the IT governance and CIO council in place to support that. So the final slide here is the actual visual roadmap itself. I'll walk through it from top to bottom. And I think some of the key things I'll mention are just the fact that you can see that these initiatives do not start all at the same time. Some could start this year, some next year, and some actually in 2016. These are calendar years that are modeled. So the top area, or top lane, relates to project management. And this is really a key component or pillar of achieving some of the successes that are intended through TIER. And you'd have in this area, you'd have some ongoing project management, some risk identification, communicating some of the savings that are taking place to the university, and then also mitigating any risks that might pop up. There'd also be some coordination of the communication and change management activities more broadly here. And this really is sort of ties together the entire program, not just at UNI, but across all 3 universities. So I think that's very important and foundational to the success of this, of TIER. Moving down is sourcing, and that could proceed in the near future. As I mentioned, that was voted on at a previous board meeting. Looking into information technology, we think that the 2 areas that Shomek addressed first, the business cases that are labeled 3 and 4, are actually ones that could be implemented before making changes to the distributed or centralized IT staffing approach. So I think that those again relate to the applications landscape, and then also the technology innovations relating to printing and VDI. We've actually modeled at UNI specifically showing the applications landscape beginning a little earlier, and then VDI potentially happen just a little later. And the reasoning for that is that there could be benefits in looking at some lessons learned if VDI moves forward at the University of Iowa, and determining sort of the dependencies and best approach to apply at UNI. The next area down is finance, and for finance we had talked about, Emily had talked about that some of the changes would take place over a multiple year timeline, and we think that that timeline could begin the end of 2015 or the beginning of 2016, and you'd actually want to have the HR 01 opportunity in place first. And again, that's just to support some of the organizational change that would be taking place in finance and IT areas. And then moving down into HR, as I had mentioned, that could start potentially in 2015, later next year, and the P&S Search Committee could begin at any point. Looking at facilities and auxiliaries, which is the next line down, after board approval, those could be implemented with university resources and could start late this year. And then finally, looking at student services, these were voted on, and RAI, I think, is an opportunity area that could begin right away, whereas the Common Application Portal is something that will be beginning in early 2015. So with that, those are just some initial ideas of how the implementation roadmap could come together. Again, these are ideas to start the dialogue. There are many things to be considered, including some of the dependencies mentioned. And with that, actually, I think we're going to open it up for Q&A, and there are 2 microphones in the room, so please do ask questions.
Thank you all very much. Can you hear me? There we go. Thank you all very much for your presentation. We will now entertain questions. If you want to come to either me or Scott Kettleson to pose your question. While those of you are compiling your questions yet that you're thinking about, I will start us off because we have received some questions online throughout the presentation. Let me see. The first one actually is an HR-specific question, and it asks to please provide some specific examples of how the formation of business partners would create efficiency. Creating additional positions to handle tasks that are currently very small components of many individuals' jobs seems to move in the direction of less efficiency, not more. What positions does Deloitte see being eliminated at the department level?
Great. Thanks, Kelly. So I think there's a couple components of that question. Maybe I'll just address the last one first. So I think across finance and HR, we're talking about portions of people's jobs. So it's very complex. It's not that there's this category of staff at the department level that could potentially move to another organization or something like that. We understand that each department's very different in how they're structured, and that's what's part of what will need to be evaluated during the design and implementation to understand what the current levels of effort are, because they differ depending on how the departments are staffed. In terms of HR, I think there's a couple different things. Well, part of it isn't just reorganizing roles. It's looking at services provided, technology, automation, processes and policies, best practice to drive some efficiencies there. But then also, if you have better trained staff in different areas that can provide services across a wide range of departments, you're then leveraging that expertise. So maybe I can provide an example with recruitment, because that's something we heard quite a bit about on this campus. So when we think about the recruitment of staff. So right now, we heard that recruitment can sometimes be very reactive. So we know a staff member's leaving, we have to fill the position. So often it falls to the hiring manager or their administrative staff person to determine, okay, what's the most up-to-date position description, where are we going to post the job, what types of basic requirements do we need. So part of the business partner role could be to facilitate some of that. So instead of someone who's maybe just hiring 1 or 2 people a year, and it's quite cumbersome every time they have to do that because they have to get up to speed on the system, figure out where all the documents are, you'd have someone that could provide that service and also be more strategic. So help the department think through, okay, we have these upcoming retirements that are forecasted. How are we thinking through how we're staffing up over the next 2 to 3 years and not just the next 6 months? Does that help clarify?
I think so.
Okay.
That was the question as posed, so I'm not sure if there are any clarifying points. We'll see if anybody follows up on a follow-up with that.
Joe's got one. All right, thank you. Well, I have a couple of questions, but I do want to have a follow-up question to that, although it's not my area. I'm a member of the faculty. I don't work in human resources. But I was a little concerned about your answer to that question, because I think the question was how many jobs would be lost by contracting with these HR business partners, which I assume is a euphemism for contracting out. And I mean, I'm assuming that. If that's not the case, then say so. But, you know, you have calculations for how much savings there would be. Now, doesn't that mean that you have calculations for FTEs to be saved by making these arrangements with business partners? I mean, I think the question really gets to, you know, what would be the FTEs or PTEs, whatever calculation you've made to save those funds. I think the question merits seems to me a more precise response.
Sure. So when we say business partners, I just want to clarify, we're not saying contracting out. These would be UNI employees that would report up to HR. So there's even potentially existing staff in the current UNI organization that would potentially want to apply for these positions, whether they're currently trained in HR services or we could train them. So it's not looking at outsourcing any services. So just want to clarify that. You're right. So what we did is we looked at we conducted interviews and we looked at different departments to try to get a feel for what types of staff members are involved in different HR activities, and we converted those to kind of FTEs because they're obviously spread out across many headcounts. And that's what we kind of use to form the basis of our analysis. So we do think there's opportunity because we did hear from a lot of people that they're spending a lot of time sometimes turning their wheels on different things because they're dealing with processes that they're potentially not well trained in, don't perform often. So we do think there's opportunity to realize savings there. So that's what we based it off of. We looked at a couple different transactional areas to determine where we could potentially reduce work. Like I said, though, this would have to be sort of confirmed during design in terms of what those efforts would be, and there potentially would even be sort of a staff ramp up period where potentially maybe you've hired 1 or 2 business partners to start serving different departments before you really take any work away. But I think part of it's also with finance and HR a greater opportunity to really use things like natural attrition or upcoming retirements to really look at the department in general to see how work is structured, to see where changes can be made. So, no, we have. We've made estimates, yes. So do you want me to talk through what those are?
The question specifically, it said, what positions does Deloitte see being eliminated at the department level? So maybe you could clarify, Emily, the number of FTEs that you identified where there could be a reduction in aggregated, so not necessarily whether it's a targeted position or how you arrived at the FTE number. And then also if you could perhaps specifically give some examples of the classifications or the jobs that you're thinking about to arrive at these FTEs.
Sure. So in terms of the impact for the HR business case for UNI, we saw that there potentially be a gross impact on 10 FTEs. We didn't identify who those people are, what departments they sit in, but we quantified that potentially an impact on 10 FTEs worth of effort. But we would estimate that over a period of 3 years, you'd be hiring 5 new business partners. So the net impact to the organization is a reduction of 5 FTEs.
Classifications or the types of positions that you looked at.
So the types of positions we looked at, secretaries, administrative assistants, administrative coordinators. We have the full list here. Let me just pull it up real quick.
Could I just add while you're looking at that?
Sure.
So just to, people hear me here? Okay. Just to kind of understand exactly what's going on in the distributed departments. We have a lot of administrative support people who wear multiple hats. I'm finance for a couple hours in the morning. I'm a little HR mixed in, a few transactions. I do a little procurement. You know, I go back to finance later on in the day. And you know what? The data on exactly how that time is spent today is not available. No one knows that. So to go make definitive decisions about any particular position in any particular department would require that information to be found. The board hasn't made any decision to move on this yet, so why invest in that data collection at this point? It's indicative enough information for the board to decide it's worth further investment of consulting hours to go investigate and staff time to go quantify that information. At that point, those ideas and those specific information will be known better. However, the concept is, if you're working on juggling 5 hats during the day, you're probably not really good, really good at anything. But if you find 7 people who are spending 20% of their time so to speak, across the distribution of departments and say, we're just going to find one person and make them the expert, give them a computer system that has better support, better written policies and procedures, better training, better reference material, ability to look up information and develop reports that today require a lot of back office or on the side spreadsheet work. You will get better service. The risk of non-compliance will go down, and you're going to be better off, and you will have a more efficient operation. Now, to do that takes an awful lot of work. It's very complex, but this has been done in many organizations. Shared services is a concept that's existed for over 20 years. It's not the first time this is being done. And so this is the thought that was behind this suggestion, and it's up to the board to decide if it proceeds, and the specifics about each individual department or any particular job classification in extreme perfection of detail is not available at this time. It's not feasible. That would be happening in the next phase. If the board proceeds to make a decision, let's move forward. And then at that time, we would sit down with people in every department. You'd know the data we're collecting. We would understand the work processes you use, the quality of the data and information you have to do that work, investigate whether there's better systems that would support that work, and then design a new process for how the one-hat expert does that job, trying to do it the best way possible. All of that would occur after the board decides to proceed on this business case.
Yeah, Rick, if I can. Is this on? Okay. If I can just clarify. So I think that was helpful context. And just to clarify what we did during this phase, so what Rick was referring to is during implementation, you'd actually have to do that resource allocation analysis, which is like a person by person, department by department look. What we did here is we took the master HR data file, we looked at categories of staff, we included secretaries, program support staff, clerks, administrative assistants, and managers, and we conducted interviews across campus, as well as we looked at the defined estimates of time spent laid out in different position descriptions to get a general sense of what we think this level of effort is. And then we validated this with different people on campus. Again, understanding that this is hard to validate in terms of each department is different. So we took a relatively conservative approach when we were determining kind of where efficiencies could be made. So just wanted to clarify, we did kind of do that first level of estimates, but the next process is really looking at that next detail down, which would be department by department and not at a broad university level.
Thank you for that clarification.
I have a follow-up because I think people are really trying to understand a possibility of what this would look like. Is this the kind of thing where you would say, okay, we have 3 or 4 small departments who each have an administrative assistant or a secretary, and then one of them would become the expert on something and another one might become the expert on something else? Is that, is that a simplification of this, or?
That's a little bit oversimplified. It's a little more complex than that. And there may be people who have 20% of their work on a particular HR process or finance process that changes in their job and nothing else changes, perhaps. I mean, depending on the way work is distributed, the impact by position will not be known until you actually investigate the position, because they're all different.
And just to clarify, are you referring to finance or HR or both?
Well, you know, I mean, we have many types of departments on the campus. I'm in academics, and so I think of academic departments where there's a unit where there are students, there are faculty, they're all a unit who have the same purpose and so forth. And that's the kind of department I'm thinking about right now. So I think, and I don't know whether that's what Joe's thinking about as well, but it's department across campus, but I think some of them operate a little bit differently than some other departments. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. There's one more aspect of what you asked that I'd like to address and also acknowledge, which is that I'm sure many people are wondering, how would this work? What would this look like? How would this actually unfold on any given campus? And that's one of the challenges of where we are in this phase right now, is that what we've described today is more of what I think of as the what. So this is what the potential opportunity might be as outlined in a business case. But the how that you're talking about, and that people are really hungry to know if this went forward, how would this work? That actually can't even be described yet because it hasn't been built. So the how is something that has to be created working very closely with representatives from individual departments and from different areas within the university, working closely with staff and faculty and anyone who's involved in the process, either as a recipient of some of the service or also somebody who performs the actual work, to design how it would happen in the future. So it's very collaborative, and it's very unique and tailored for an individual university, too. So when Emily showed earlier that spectrum of ways that work could work in a college-based model or a university-wide model within a given institution, and she talked about the fact that there are hybrids in between, that's something she was getting at, is there's not a cookie cutter. It really is a matter of working closely to design how that would work in the future. So it's a great question. I'm sure it's on a lot of people's minds, so I wanted to acknowledge that. Thanks.
And one thing that might be helpful is, Emily, if you could elaborate just briefly on HR and finance. We're kind of blending the two right now in discussion, but they're actually slightly different approaches at UNI. So perhaps you can just highlight what the differences are between their finance and HR areas.
Yeah, so for finance, really talking about shared services, looking at more transactional areas. So again, those two options I talked through, it could be a college-based model, university-wide model, hybrid, depending on where you sit in the institution. But really looking at finance transactions, and those staff could potentially report up to a new shared services organization. The business partner model we're really viewing as more of kind of a center of excellence, or people that really understand HR processes, policies, procedures, and would actually report up through HR, even if they sit locally. So if you have some of the bigger units on campus that are doing a lot of staff hiring or just have a lot of staff that need HR support, they could still sit within that organization, but they would report up through HR to kind of have a more comprehensive HR services across campus. Is that helpful?
So just to follow up, and I don't want to, make a big deal out of this, but Emily, I want to thank you for the clarification on the contracting out question, the business partner model. But Rick, I wasn't asking, what the board's going to approve. I was trying to follow up on the question that Kelly asked about what the FTE loss would be, and Emily started answering that question, and then Kelly asked for more information about classifications, and you were answering that question. You were in the process of answering it. I wonder if you could finish answering that question just for sake of transparency. Thank you.
Okay, so on the, we were not focused on, in terms of different classifications of staff. We did look at, we know there's differences, and we took samplings of job descriptions. But like I mentioned, we were looking at groups of staff, including secretaries, program support, clerks, administrative assistants, and managers. But I think what you're getting at too is, I know we've heard across the 3 campuses, there are different classifications of staff. There are different unions that come into play. We were not making any assumptions about any of those classifications of staff. Anything that would be, any changes that would be made would obviously have to be in line with current practices, current union contracts. So we're not suggesting any changes there. And also really looking at this as an opportunity to really use natural attrition, because we did look at kind of historical attrition rates in these categories of staff of people who are just willingly leaving the organization. So there's an opportunity to really use that and work with the departments to kind of restructure as those changes occur.
And one thing I would add is that there are assumptions that are laid out in the materials that are available online, and you can see some of the drivers for how the numbers were arrived at. There are slides that are specific to each university and to each business case that have some of that detail.
Hi, I have a question. You had mentioned about the full-time equivalents, and anytime you bring up eliminating a full-time equivalent, you're going to pique people's interest. Now, you said that you had done your interviews on campus, but did you actually interview any administrative staff, or did you just interview department heads and those types of things? Did you actually sit down with the secretaries, the administrative assistants, the office coordinators, and discuss what they do?
Yeah, we did meet with a a sampling of administrative staff and also the department managers. We were kind of, given the breadth of the institution and how different each department was, we were looking for some of that input from department managers as well, in terms of them having kind of a broader sense of how work is structured in each department.
Can I ask how many that you spoke with campus-wide over the 3 Regents institutions?
Sure. We have that list somewhere. I don't have the number off the top of my head.
I mean the actual clerical, administrative people, not the department heads.
Yeah, we can definitely get that number for you. I don't have it.
Follow up with Kelly on that one.
Yeah.
Because I guess I'm just interested, you're saying that none of this is coming into play yet, that if this is something that is going to be looked at by the Board of Regents, that then more research and more data would be collected. But how can you come here and say, we've talked to, I'm just going to say 10 people, basically it's a guesstimate on your part, and even bring up this to even go to the Board of Regents? Wouldn't it require a little bit more research, a little bit more detail into it to even bring this as a possibility?
I'm sure that must be frustrating to hear that. But let's remember from the beginning in terms of how we describe this project, we're sequentially taking layers off the onion. So we started out with opportunities. We came up with 97 pages of opportunities in our first phase 1 report. The Board of Regents selected some of those. We're now looking at those in more detail. We're not going to go provide the full answer because it would take too long to produce that answer and be totally definitive, even then when we would know that we don't know if the board is going to proceed or not. So we take just enough of the next layer off to make a management decision about, is this worth pursuing to the next layer? And in the next phase, we're calling it implementation, would not only involve the data collection you mentioned, but also the formation of work groups oriented around these key processes. It could be procurement, it could be a set of finance transactions, and find the people who tend to do the most of those transactions, get some other representative people who also do those transactions at the clerical level, directly hands-on, and put them on a team and facilitate a team process through multiple meetings to quantify and define the different ways things are done today, and identify among that group with management agreement as to what would be a good way of doing that process in the future in order to design the new process. That's the design process. It's silly to invest in doing that step, right, and at this stage, because it would be too costly. The board wouldn't have an answer for months about, is it worth even pursuing this area. So apologize for the frustrating component of this, but at this stage it's just not feasible to come in and say these are the exact positions and here's the exact numbers, because we know they're only estimates and the data wasn't available. What we did was use the available data we could find to make our best guess, and we're admitting that that's really fundamentally all it is at this stage.
Well, I'd like to maybe just add something to that, which is that in addition to conversations, though, that we've had with some of the folks that Emily outlined and in the reading of the job descriptions that she was talking about, there were some additional inputs into this analysis, which I think I covered maybe at the beginning, and then each of the leads covered a little bit as well. But looking at some data such as the types of technology that are used in the process. So how much of the process is automated helped us get a gauge too for how much time is spent in certain kinds of transactions. Another thing we looked at is, for example, other organizations that have transactions of this type and how much time their organizations typically spend in these different transaction types. So that's another input that helps shape the analysis. We also looked at things like the processes used in transactions, just at a very initial level, though, to get an understanding of the type of work that's done in these particular areas. So we used as many of the available inputs that we could, with the recognition that if this is an area that the board wants to pursue, again, this is something that then needs to involve all of the people who are doing that type of work, or at least a very solid group of them, to actually get further into the detail of how more precision on how much time is spent on various transactions.
Okay, thank you. I have another question that was submitted electronically, since nobody's jumping up to pose a question quite yet.
Oh, there's one, Kelly.
Okay, I will, yeah.
Yeah, it's all right. My question probably falls more into the how category that you said you weren't really at this point in time. But regarding the HR business partners, I think one very valid question would be focused on unit or departmental ownership of culture. And specifically, you've talked about the job placement, the advertisement, the resource, the referrals that need to be gathered. But I'm curious about the end process and how much this process might remove ownership of the selection of the final candidate from the department.
Yeah, and
you're asking me to clarify whether it's faculty or staff or administrative, but I don't think it really matters. I think it's a question that's applicable to all types of units.
Sure, absolutely. And I think part of, so there's two components. So again, in terms of the how, all of this would need to sort of be figured out, but in terms of what the best model would be for you and I if this were to move forward. But in terms of that departmental specific culture, I think that's the value of moving to part of a more business partner model in terms of you could have different people assigned to different departments. So if there's a culture that's very different in one area, you'd expect those people to be aware of that. Just as well, if there's, hiring managers always need to be involved no matter, what the job is. So in terms of interviewing the candidates, being there to, do any initial selection, but really kind of the more HR expertise, administrative components, and also kind of helping guide the departments in some of that decision-making process could be done through these business partners. Does that help?
One thing I would add too is that typically the business partner helps to sort of identify and work with the departments, identify when needs might be upcoming, help to cultivate recruiting pipelines, but traditionally business partners don't play that selection role. So that's something that, of course, as we're pointing out, needs to be determined, but that's not a typical role of a business partner.
Emily, I'm going to pick on you again if I can. Let me just ask you a question. I don't know of any department heads that were contact on the academic side of the university. Because we're in the largest college here at the university, and there was no dialogue with department heads.
Okay, we, again, can look at that list. We spoke to a lot of department managers on the administrative side as well.
It's different, so that's why I was wondering if you could clarify that.
Yeah, so we did meet with a lot of department administrative staff. At some points, I believe some of the academic department heads were brought into the discussion when needed. But we didn't, not when needed, but I mean, we were scheduling meetings and they were bringing in their department heads to provide input as well. But we can get that, that list.
And then if I could ask an IT question so he's not alone. There's, I have 57 people in a very large department, so the shared printer would be very, very interesting. And I know there's a lot of researchers probably in the room that think, wow, we have really specialized software, and what types of issues would be involved in that process?
Yeah, certainly. So in terms of the printer initiative by itself, we are suggesting certain ideas which range from the simpler to the more complex. The simpler is, let's look at some of the paper utilization. Can we do certain things so that we print more duplex over time, which we've seen in other case studies through more education, change management can typically increase. So that's one small, that's one spectrum of it. The other spectrum of it, looking at the local printers and the network printers as well, it certainly is a key problem. What we have seen is that your network printers on a per unit cost basis are far cheaper than your local printers. There are certainly networking mechanisms by which we can look at the types of users and look at how many types of network printers you do need. And what we've seen is that over time, as some of it is also generational in nature, as people are able to get more comfortable with features like store and print, which deals with, say, confidentiality issues. Then there is a movement from more local printers to network printers over time. There are a couple of not naming names, but there are even within the 3 universities, there are a couple of departments that have utilized some of the messaging platforms over 3 years and have been able to make substantial progress out there as well. So we think that there is that opportunity across that spectrum, obviously starting from simpler, show some momentum there, and kind of go towards the other pieces as well.
And Shomik, just to add a little bit more, build on that question for a minute, is it fair to say too that across different departments there would need to be a process of understanding what requirements are for those different departments before enacting any changes to the way the printers are used? I mean, different departments are going to have different needs depending on the number of people and the type of printing and the capabilities of software, et cetera, that's needed for printouts. So I think that could vary quite a bit, but would have to be better understood during requirements gathering.
Yeah, it certainly will vary as well. And so we have not assumed that all of those could be changed. We've assumed some portion of it could be changed based on our read of the complexity of the printing environment and what could potentially change as well. So
I started with a Mimeo machine, There used to be people lined up, so I understand.
Hopefully we don't get you back to that.
I have a question, sorry to go back to the shared services, but how do you build redundancy into that if you talk about business partners that are from either on the college level or university level, or a person who's very specific in one area when he or she goes out on medical leave or vacation? What happens with that redundancy? We've often heard about the generalist approach, where it's kind of a one-stop shop you can go, and it may be a little less efficient, but there's built-in redundancy. So if you could just maybe explain that a little bit.
Absolutely. Whatever model is chosen, I think that cross-training component is really important. And I think that's part of one of the challenges we actually heard about today, that in some departments that are don't have a lot of administrative staff, there's no redundancy. So somebody is on leave and there's no one to kind of fill their role. So definitely at the university-wide model, you would definitely have that redundancy because you'd have more staff in different areas that could provide services across campus. The college-based model as well, you'd need to kind of evaluate the staffing levels at each unit to ensure that if you only have enough volume to maybe justify having one person in a certain area, that someone else would need to be cross-trained to be able to backfill while they're out. So that's a really great point. That's definitely an important consideration.
I would like to return to Shomik and the shared printers. And I looked on the website, and in your cost savings, you mentioned IT support savings, because anecdotally, I can mention that I think in our department, connecting to a shared printer is much more difficult than connecting to local printers, especially for non-standard machines. But my question is, did you figure in the cost of faculty time walking to the printer, arriving at the printer, and seeing that there's a 10-minute print job ahead of them before they can get their thing? Often that might be walking to the printer with a student who you have just printed out something to them. Have you considered faculty time in your cost calculations?
Yeah, then that's a great question. Part of the printer business case is that there is a movement around how printing will kind of get done. There are lots of printers, for example, that kind of give you a sense for this is in queue, and it has basically printed as well. So there are certain characteristics of those printers. Now, are those characteristics across all the printers? Probably not. But what we assumed is that over 2 to 3 years, as the evolution of these network printers and as the features of these network printers basically become more similar, like store and print, ability to provide status updates of when it's printed, and those will basically become enablers for more of the, if you will, the streamlining of the printer environment over the longer term.
Got an IT question for you, Shima.
Please.
I think I was in the report, the Resistance 2. Virtual desktops. I do have a lot of concern there because I think we're missing a lot of cost figures. I know that we've recently had announcements about Google, unlimited this, unlimited that. We're a Google campus. We're perched to do a lot of things. And horsepower in desktops, creativity from individuals to do things seems to be rather limited by VDI from my perspective. I think we did, you suggest a pilot. We did one a year and a half ago. We redid cost figures in the last 6 to 8 months. We got to $250,000 of recurring software costs, and I told the guys, quit it. Just stop it. Because I don't see those in your cost estimate. They're not, you know, the heads down people like the PII people, maybe, but that's a very, very small percentage of our population. Yeah. And this really concerns me that my university is going the wrong direction with VDI.
That's a great question. So, you know, let me give you a comprehensive reply to that. Basically, as we looked at the 5,000 plus Windows desktops that were used on campus, and you were part of that process too, what we tried to understand was what was the usage patterns of these Windows desktops. So we focused attention, we tried to understand how much of this was more simpler, standardized usage, where people are basically using it to use, say, Microsoft Office, go on the internet, use some Java clients, if you will. That's at the simpler end of the spectrum, to where you know, the other side of the spectrum is where there can be a lot of different softwares that are basically used by these users. So now what we did, we tried to understand what that spectrum of usage was. And similar to what a number of universities do as well, we looked at basically the VDI solution as being more applicable to the simpler spectrum of the users, where software is far more well-defined in usage. We understand the licensing parameters for that software far better, as well as you can understand, a number of those users. I mean, there's a difference between persistent and non-persistent users, where more of the users are more non-persistent users. And so we factored all of those into the cost estimates. You're right about, you know, at the higher end of VDI, where there are a number of software licenses. For example, there are a number of the software license contracts for this university that are less favorable for VDI than the other two universities, because in the other two universities there are contracts and negotiated that allow more broad spread usage. So we certainly understand that. We have buckets of contingency built into the VDI business case, even for the lower end of the VDI business case, if you will. So we think that we have a number of those cases and costs built in too. But a pilot will certainly be required to really understand what the impacts are. Because the other piece I will mention is that in some of the cases that we've looked at, you know, there may be a lot of licenses that may be floating around, but really understanding what is the real usage of those licenses helps to kind of give you two types of efficiencies. One is optimize the licenses, and second, utilize them in the VDI business case, if you will. So, you know, we would say that we have looked through most of the key costs are there. We've also provided fairly large contingencies as well for those software devices too as well.
So can I just follow up on that, Tom? Because we also had a question submitted very similar to that online, but you talked about the cost for the virtual licenses. So are those included as cost factors when people look at the detail on the business case, or are they netted perhaps somewhere? Or where will people see those costs that you're talking about relative to the licensing or other technology costs involved with the VDI solution?
So those are basically shown as software licensing costs that are you know, if they are netted within the overall business case, but the details of those calculations are provided with the ITS department. But these are netted, but suffice it to say that a lot of those costs, licensing cost calculations, are built into the business case itself. And well, one of the reasons I will also mention is that we also understand that because of the lower number of desktops and the greater software licensing complexity at UNI, we kind of see that the payback period for that initiative is much higher than the other universities, which is why, one of the things that we are suggesting is that there does need to be a very thoughtful consideration, if it were ever approved, to look at a very thoughtful consideration where, ISU, for example, has had a lot of good experience with it. We would suggest that, for instance, now, the potential technology direction that we could utilize here could be more of the Microsoft variety, for example, which University of Iowa could be looking at. So we would suggest a very thoughtful approach where looking at the results of that pilot from University of Iowa will be very beneficial to what could be impactful here. So.
I think we should be interested in looking at that very, very closely.
Sure.
Very closely. The other thing I had was the infrastructure the implementation be lumpy.
Yes, yes.
I agree with you there.
Yes.
One of the things I am really concerned about is it also starts chewing up our network. And we've done a lot recently that the PCs don't cost that much anymore. Mm-hmm. A PC in the computer labs is probably a fourth of the cost. 3/4 of the cost is the network. And of course, you're going to tie up that network traffic that we've been trying to free up so we can do more stuff with Google. So the infrastructure changes may not be in the desktop, but they also may be sneaking into your network infrastructure cost. And those have been just going crazy. So,
certainly network is a key piece as well. And as you look at it as well, going back to your lumpy comment, right? I mean, certainly certain VDI investments can be lumpy, but we're also suggesting that you would not build a capacity for 5,000 and users don't come. You'd be looking at more 300 to 500 types of users and building that over time, what we kind of call more of a scalability factor. But we certainly think that looking at network capacity over time is certainly going to be important too.
So with all this talk about lumpiness that I really don't understand, I think it's worth spending a minute just talking about how this might unfold. So if there was a decision to move forward on this by the board, there would be a team formed to go address this. Their information in further detail would be brought to bear. We would go through a filtering process to determine, have some criteria created for where it's appropriate to employ virtual desktop innovation, VDI as we're referring to it, where it's appropriate and where it's not, and what other concerns we would have that would get raised, and what would be the risk mitigation plan against those risks. And for example, in terms of like chewing up a network, for example, maybe there's a pilot you do first to see how it behaves, and you measure the results, and then you decide you keep pouring it on. All that being said, you just get an idea of how these things would be unfolding. But that is exactly why our estimates could go down as well as up. And we know that. And that is just the part of the process of where we are. So we're going to be reasonable about it. We want to have it be fact-based. And if the numbers say the estimate doesn't stand, the estimate doesn't stand. The idea for the board, I think, is to create a portfolio of opportunities. You can see we've got a dozen or so going, and you could imagine if that portfolio were added to over time. This gets pretty complex after some time, but you can also see how you can then have meaningful impact on the cost of education in Iowa, because you're doing enough things in enough areas that bear fruit and ultimately improve the cost of education. Just a thought about that lumpiness that I don't understand.
Hi, my question is for Virginia. Back to the FTEs. You indicated that you compared us to others. Who did you compare us to?
Well, just to clarify, I wasn't talking about comparing specific numbers of FTEs to others. What I'm saying is that when we look at the way work gets done and the types of ways you can change work to simplify the way that work processes are done, or use technology to help simplify processes, that's where I'm talking about. We've looked at other institutions and other organizations that have made changes in areas where transactions are processed or different kinds of work gets done.
Who were those that you compared us to?
It depends across different business cases or different business case areas. Some of the work that we've done at other institutions across our entire firm. So Deloitte's a very large company. We've done thousands, tens of thousands of projects of lots of different types all across the world. And some of these are higher education, some of them are other types of organizations, commercial organizations, but we've worked directly with organizations like UC Berkeley or University of Texas, Texas A&M, Harvard, Dartmouth, Tufts University, in many of these transaction areas that we're talking about today. So that's just a sampling, but it gives you an idea of some of the organizations where we have some idea of how work is done and what technology is used and ways to simplify the work.
So are you saying that you compared us to those that you listed?
I'm saying that we looked at the way that work and transactions happen. So transactions within finance, for example, that Emily was talking about. How are accounts payable processes performed, or what's the likelihood that you can use technology for travel and expense? You know, all those different types of areas that we looked at to get a sense when we're making these estimates. It's just another input into the other inputs that we already talked about today.
So you're not going to give us a list of who you compared our university to on these processes?
Maybe I can help clarify too. I think what you're getting at too is wanting to understand more of about benchmarking and those sorts of things. So part of what we did, I know, for finance and HR is there's many different cross-industry benchmarks you can use. So we have a global benchmarking study at Deloitte that actually puts out an annual survey. So they look at some higher ed institutions for some of these transactions, but then also across industries as well, looking at different public sector entities and then corporate situations. Anytime where we were kind of comparing to see where the different universities fell, if we were looking at more corporate benchmarks that had the sampling of different industries, we always use the high cost performer benchmark because we understand that we're in an, a nonprofit space. You're not being, there are different motivating factors here and different limitations in terms of how efficient you can be. But then also understanding that benchmarks have to be taken with a grain of salt. So if you think about, if you were to look at a transaction benchmark for travel and expense, for example, in terms of how many vouchers you should be processing on an annual basis and what that effort looks like, the University of Iowa is going to be able to process way more vouchers than you and I, because you're not automated in that space currently. So you always have to understand that greater context of the technology, the process that's in place at each institution. And I think that's what Virginia was referring to as well, as using our past experience to understand how we can optimize some of these areas that may not be the most efficient currently.
And to answer your question directly, in many cases, for example, when we look at data that comes from our Global Benchmarking Center, they do focus studies. They contact organizations. They have them sign a contract that says, I'm going to supply this information to you on the volume of my transactions, the cost of what I spend on these transactions. They're going to spend a lot of time to go through the data collection to do that. And we sign a contract that says we're not going to reveal the name of the organization specifically. So what we have as a result of these studies is maybe 20, maybe 50 organizations that have signed that contract with us. So we can't identify specifically, here's the exact 13 schools we used. We can say, we looked at a benchmark that shows these kinds of organizations do accounts payable, and we would say that actually some commercial organizations might actually be relevant in such a comparison, or in payroll, for example, something very standardized. And we know we have the list of the types of institutions in that. Our Global Benchmarking Center looks at that list and says, we think this is a useful comparison to the organization you're doing, and we don't even see that list. Okay, so I'm sorry, but be able to say what we did is we compared with what I would argue are useful rules of thumb that come from looking at many organizations in an organized fashion based on measurements that organizations, clients have taken, or non-clients have taken for themselves, and they themselves are using the results of those reports to go make their own recommendations and their own adjustments in their own organizations. So I'm sorry we can't provide, we unfortunately can't provide the specifics of the specific companies, but that's the nature of the data that we have used. Yep.
Hi. Hi, I work in IT. I used to work in the distributed environment. I've really spent a lot of time reading the tier stuff, and I tried to understand kind of what your vision was around IT. And it kind of boiled down to, okay, we're going to use VDI technology to centralize desktops, desktop management, server management. But as I went through the report, you had identified 40 distributed IT employees, and it talked about a reduction through attrition of approximately 6 FTE. But I used to be one of those distributed people, and I know what I did, but almost everything that I used to do, you had being moved into central IT. So I really struggled to understand what the distributed IT people are going to be left doing if desktop management was taken away from them, if server management was taken away from them, if printers were reduced to a handful of network printers, which, by the way, is a great idea. I'm all for it. Right. That's actually the least radical thing in all of the IT stuff in terms of where we are from here. But I really struggled to understand that because it really didn't seem to fit with what I did, and there are several of the other people here, and I don't get that part.
Yeah, well, as we basically looked at the key capabilities that are provided by the distributed IT model, they ably support the IT service delivery model. There are a number of things like, for example, developing business intelligence reports, applications, local applications, for example, supporting those local applications. A lot of that work, having that, the business analytics brain, understanding what each department requires, is all resident there. A number of these systems, for example, POS systems, are typically done only in one team. There is no potential, efficiency in bringing that in the central area. So we think that there is there's a ton of real value-added work that's done in the distributed IT team that we are not suggesting would have any changes. But in the theme of looking at efficiencies where possible, where there's potentially lower risk as well, that's why we kind of looked at some of those capabilities, like say desktop management or server management.
Sure. I was just struggling to understand, we have 34 people doing business intelligence. I mean, that's like a lot of report writers.
No. I mean, there's a lot of people who are doing application development. There's a lot of people who are doing, say, BI. But that's roughly, I don't have the precise numbers, but that's roughly about half of them as well. So we are not suggesting that, the effort is not going to go away. It's only a small proportion of effort that will actually go away.
Okay.
Okay. This is my last question, I promise. And it's not really a question, it's just a follow-up. I don't know, in terms of your printers, your population of printers, I think you mentioned 1,000 printer workstations that you think that you've looked at. And I just want to say, and here I am speaking to a certain extent on behalf of the faculty, if you start taking printers out of faculty offices, that's going to be I think not only here on this university, but on all 3 campuses, that would be a big issue for our workstation. It's a big issue for attracting faculty, and as my colleague in mathematics mentioned a while ago, it's also a really big issue in terms of organizing our work. I can't imagine very many things that would create more inefficiency in the academic part of this university's mission than to take printers out of the faculty office. So I hope you'll really give that a lot of serious consideration. Thank you.
Certainly. So we are not going to be taking any of the printers away, but what we are going to be able to do is, what we would like to do is, we'd like to be able to portray some of the features that are available from some of these other network printers. And they have a ton of capabilities that could be leveraged by, even faculty, for example. And over time, if some of the faculty see the benefit on that, there is potential of, some cost synergies. But clearly there's no move to take those away, but the idea is to be able to, provide more information and education about what these network printers can do. We've also seen that, some people kind of get comfortable over time and don't need these local printers over time. So that's the idea.
Well, thank you for the clarification. When I heard that network hubs for printers, I just presumed that meant then some printers would be being taken away, and that when I hear 1,000, I think, well, how do you do that without, penetrating into the faculty on that? So yeah. Thank you.
I mean, it clearly is an intricate piece where there has to be a system of incentives, system of change management, education. There are some areas where you cannot do away with those as well. So I mean, it is more intricate, but there are some units and departments that have had some success with it as well.
I'd like to ask one more question that was submitted electronically, and this deals with, in the report there's a reference to span of control, an increased span of control. Please define span of control. Then they went on to suggest, for example, should that be calculated based on where hiring decisions are made?
Yeah, so the span of control basically is is a metric that's calculated, which suggests that one manager basically is able to direct the work of so many X team members. And in terms of hiring decisions, that's not the domain of hiring decisions as to who gets hired. But what we suggest is that the IT span of control should be looked at over a medium-term, longer-term basis, because this requires a little bit more longer-term planning to kind of get to a higher span of control, if you will. So it determines the operating model design to some extent, but doesn't determine who or what needs to get hired.
All right, thank you.
I have a question about the process as we go forward. It seems to me the Board of Regents has made two major decisions so far. The first is to enter the contract, and the second was to move forward on these business cases. And my question is, how many more major decisions are left on the business cases that are proposed today? Is there a vote in November to begin implementation, or is it, or will there, or how many more major votes do they have on these business cases?
Sure, I'm happy to clarify that, and then certainly if there's anything else, we can ask Mark Braun if he has any other points to add to that as the transformation program manager. But my understanding of how the process is going to work is that in mid-November, I think it's November 14th, the board is going to be voting on the 8 business cases that we presented today. So the remaining administrative business cases that we presented. And at that point, they're going to be deciding which of these to move forward with implementation. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, but it does raise a bit of a concern for me then when the answers to the questions about research or we haven't done, we don't know, we're not to that stage yet, that we're voting to implement when, when we're asking fairly specific questions. I understand that research needs to happen, but I guess my preference would be that the board have another check at that point. My real fear is on some of these business cases that we go down the path and suddenly we add people in places, and then the answer is, but we can't eliminate any of the positions, and we've essentially voted to implement, or we start to do the thin clients, and we don't do enough of them to really have savings. And so I guess my concern is that there's not another hard vote before we actually move forward. I understand they can back out at any point in time, but I think there should be another hard vote once the cases are further developed. But I'm very sympathetic also to
That's a great point, and I think that's just rests as undefined at this point, because the board decisions to move forward for some of the ones that, like P&S staff and so forth, are fairly simple to move forward on the portal. But these other ones could be quite complex, and one could argue it would be better to add in, we would certainly want to as advisors to the process, saying this is the implementation plan that we've come up jointly with the teams we formed and worked with. This is an outline of the design, right? We'd clearly have to share that with Mark, and maybe it would be up to Mark's judgment at this point to decide what to take to the board as to whether or not to inform them about the specifics to moving forward, or to say, well, this one's got some serious questions about it, we better have a specific review of it, and as to exactly what is the extent of implementation. Do you cut back and do something smaller and have a reduced benefit out of the initiative and so forth. I think the process of how we move it forward, we just haven't gotten into doing it yet, but I think we would need to lay out what that is and have kind of the rules of the road, if you will, and decision points defined before just launching off on that. We just can't just go form teams and come up with solutions and go do it without talking to managers in the organization. And then we're hoping that the existing way you work as an organization takes hold, so that if someone did have an issue, okay, and we let's say we even agreed to disagree, okay, that someone did have an issue, they can highlight that to Mark, they can highlight through their president, use the existing communications and reporting lines to escalate that, to bring that up to form, to have a real discussion about it and bring resolution. I think we want to work with you. We want success here. You want success here. We don't want to force you to do something that's irrational and way too far, because that's not productive. So I think we do need to kind of further define that process, but clearly it's the back of our minds. We're not going to move forward just on the basis of one vote from the Board of Regents.
Well, and I wonder if I could just add something to that, which is that in any of these more complex business case areas, we also feel very strongly about, and I think you saw in the roadmap that Dave was walking us through a little bit earlier, we feel really strongly about the idea of piloting, so that you pilot a change, you understand how well it's working or not working, you make adjustments based on the information you've gathered from that pilot, and then you're continuously improving the way that you're implementing any given area. So it's really important to think of this as a process, that it is something, it's a journey, it unfolds over time, and there has to be really an intense focus on not only collaboration, but also calibrating how well things are working, because it is something that, as you're saying, I mean, it's very important to make sure that you're not entering into changes without considering how you're going to make those tweaks and even bigger changes as needed.
Our time is winding down. We've got time for just one or two more questions.
Hi, yes, thank you. I work specifically in IT here on campus, so my question goes towards that specifically, but any of the areas where we've talked about attrition, I guess, could be applicable as well. I don't know, it just feels, and I think other IT people in the room with me could say that we just feel like we've got a project backlog a mile long. And when we talk about attrition or losing positions, I'm hoping that you got a sense for some of that kind of urgency from us when you went through interviews, and that can be taken into account moving forward, that if we had to lose some positions, even if it is through natural attrition, that there are just some things we might not be able to get to. And then also, how could we implement some of these new technologies that maybe we don't have the expertise on today, like the virtual desktops and stuff. So
that's an excellent question. So certainly we did understand the urgency on campus that technology is a key enabler for a lot of the business process changes on campus, so we certainly get that. Yeah, we're also suggesting some other technology changes on top of that. A lot of the changes we suggest today are more for the operational aspects, the transactional aspects. However, something that you'll see on the slides as well is that we do suggest in terms of, say, project work, that there could be a slight elevation in some of the business case discipline and the rigor, which can help to to have both sides. I mean, where IT and its business stakeholders have a more productive discussion around, these are what the costs are, these are what the benefits are, and then to prioritize it that way, is a more productive dialogue that could help to maybe prioritize that funnel a little bit better. But we certainly understand that it's a challenge. We are suggesting some of the transactional work could be reduced using technology innovation over the longer term. But for project work, there certainly are some categories of recommendations that we're making there as well.
I have just one last question then that was submitted online, and this is also relating to IT, specifically IT business case 01 and 02, with a reference to a chargeback model and the need for IT staff to track time usage. Can you elaborate further on how a chargeback system may work, and is time tracking tied into chargebacks?
Yeah, so the recommendation for time tracking is that highly effective and efficient IT organizations can understand where their effort is being spent. There is a prevailing thought of the IT balance sheet or the IT income statement, which is basically what are my costs and what is the value that I'm getting from IT. And unless IT staff are able to put their time towards efforts, how do we know what value there is? But that is an ongoing, more of a higher level strategic thought process that a lot of IT organizations and IT leaders can use to show what value they've generated. We are not suggesting so that is an ongoing leading practice, if you will, that a lot of organizations are starting to use, and we suggest that is a practice that the three IT organizations can look at as well. University of Iowa has already started that about 4 months ago. In terms of ADM chargeback, or application development and maintenance chargeback, we don't suggest that currently, because there is a lot of effort that needs to be done in terms of application development and maintenance chargeback. But as we suggest, as there be greater rigor in terms of these business cases, and that by itself helps to focus IT value greater. However, if in 2-3 years' time, that effort really does not bear fruit, then in some cases you may have to look at application development and maintenance chargeback, because the only way for people to realize that IT does cost money, and I need to be able to make sure that I'm getting enough money from that, is in some cases ADM chargeback. But just to be very clear, we're not suggesting that. We are suggesting that as a potential option in the longer term, should business case rigor not work.
All right, thank you. That brings us to the conclusion of our town hall meeting. I'd like to thank everybody for coming. I'd also like to remind you that the slides from today's presentation will be on the tier page of the UNI website. There is also a form there for your feedback. We are very interested in your feedback and continued thoughts. As was noted at the beginning, at the next board meeting on October 22nd and 23rd, the board is asking for feedback from the institution presidents. We need your feedback so that we can summarize and provide, whether it be Acting President Licari or President Rood, with that information so they can best represent our feedback for UNI. So please, I would encourage you to use that form that's on the website. You can also contact me directly, Kelly Flaggy. You can also have conversations with your supervisors, your division heads, or any dean or department head. Also the sounding board members, who are also listed on our website. They are all excellent resources that you can share your suggestions or your feedback with if you would prefer not to do it online. I would ask that that feedback be submitted no later than Friday, October 17th. That will give us a few days to make sure that we've gone through all the comments, all the feedback, and summarized them appropriately so that we are prepared for that presentation at the board meeting. Also, as I noted earlier, this streaming meeting will be available on the website. It will probably be a couple days. So I would say by Wednesday or Thursday of this week, you'll be able to access this, or certainly share it with anybody who wasn't able to attend. Thank you, everyone, again. Thank you to our Deloitte consultants for your presentation, and I appreciate you taking your time. Have a good evening.
Thank you for your questions today. We appreciate it.
There will be press availability in the room behind us as well for those here for that.